4 days ago, Donald Trump landed in Beijing. He shook hands, he smiled, he called it the greatest meeting in the history of diplomacy. And then 48 hours later, he walked into a press conference in Washington and said something that no sitting American president has ever said about a neighbor, an ally, a partner of over a century. He said Canada was a drain. He said Canadian automakers were stealing American jobs with Chinese technology. He said he was prepared to raise automotive tariffs on Canada to levels that would, in his exact words, make their industry disappear. Not slow down, not restructure, disappear. The room went quiet, not the silence of agreement, the silence of people who have just heard a threat so extreme that the normal machinery of political response cannot process it quickly enough. That press conference lasted 22 minutes, but what it set in motion will be studied for decades. Because Donald Trump did not fire the first shot in a trade war that day. He fired the last one he could afford. And in Ottawa, a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment quietly opened a folder on his desk and began to read. To understand what happened next, you need to understand one number. $1.2 trillion. That is the annual contribution of the North American automotive industry to the American economy, not the global industry, not the Canadian industry. The North American industry, the integrated, cross-border, endlessly interconnected machine that the United States, Canada, and Mexico built together over 30 years since NAFTA. $1.2 trillion, supporting 10.1 million American jobs. And here is the thing that Washington never explained to the American public. That machine does not have a border. A single engine component can cross the US-Canada border multiple times before it reaches the finished vehicle. A circuit board installed in a seat manufactured in Ontario moves to Michigan for integration, returns to Quebec for quality calibration, and completes its journey in an Ohio assembly plant. The supply chain has no inside and no outside. It is a single organism. When the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian automotive products and components, they did not strike a foreign competitor. They injected poison into their own bloodstream. The numbers surfaced within months. American car prices began rising. Industry analysts projected that each new vehicle sold in the United States could increase in price by anywhere between $3,000 and $10,000, depending on the model and the depth of its Canadian component dependency. American consumers, the very voters the administration had promised to protect, were now paying the invoice for a trade war waged in their name. But the price increase was not the most dangerous consequence. The most dangerous consequence was the one that never appeared in a press release. It appeared in a boardroom in Frankfurt, in a strategic planning session in Tokyo, in a private equity firm in London. And the question being asked in all of those rooms, quietly, carefully, was the same. Is North America still safe? In 3 decades, the United States had been the anchor of every major industrial investment decision in the Western world. Predictable rules, vast consumer market, reliable supply chains. When you invested in America, you knew what you were getting. Now with one executive order, the entire architecture could be disrupted in a matter of weeks. And global capital began asking the question that no economy can afford to have asked about it. What if we built somewhere else? Mark Carney did not respond to Trump's press conference with anger. He did not hold an emergency session of Parliament. He did not summon the American ambassador. He did not post on social media. He did not say a single word in public for 36 hours after the press conference ended. What he did was call 3 people, not politicians. He called the people who understand how capital moves when it decides it needs a new home. Because Carney is not a politician who learned economics. He is an economist who entered politics after reaching the summit of the global financial system. A PhD in economics from Oxford, 13 years at Goldman Sachs, governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, the first and only non-British citizen ever appointed to that role, chairman of the Financial Stability Board, the man who helped redesign global financial regulation after the 2008 crisis. When Trump threatened Canada's automotive industry, he was not threatening a politician who would respond with outrage. He was threatening an architect of the system who understood, with clinical precision, exactly which lever to pull next. And the lever Carney chose to pull had a name. It was called EV. While Washington was locked in a political debate about protecting internal combustion engines, and while American culture wars raged around oil, pickup trucks, and the alleged threat of electric vehicles, the rest of the world had already moved. Norway had electrified nearly its entire new car market. China had built the largest battery supply chain on the planet. The European Union had committed hundreds of billions of euros to the green transition. The global automotive industry was not debating whether electric vehicles were the future. The global automotive industry was debating who would control the supply chain that made them. And Canada had something that every player in that race desperately needed: lithium, nickel, cobalt, cheap, clean hydroelectric power, vast industrial space, a government willing to provide long-term subsidies and policy stability, and critically, something that no amount of money can manufacture overnight: the political will to move fast. In the first 3 months of 2026, EV sales in Canada rose more than 74% compared to the same period the previous year. More than 21,000 zero-emission vehicles were sold in a single month, March alone. Electric vehicles now accounted for more than 12% of all new car sales in Canada, up from roughly 6% the year before. This was not an accident, it was a policy. Ottawa had deployed a federal rebate program offering up to $5,000 on eligible EV purchases. It had accelerated permitting for gigafactory construction near hydroelectric sources, and it had done something that caused a near-panic response in certain corridors of Washington. It opened the door to Chinese electric vehicles. Not wide open, not without conditions. The terms required Chinese EV companies to establish joint ventures, manufacturing partnerships for batteries or vehicles, inside Canada within a specified timeline. The tariff framework for qualifying Chinese EVs was substantially lower than the American equivalent. What this meant in strategic terms was devastating to the White House's entire trade logic. A vehicle manufactured in Ontario through a Canadian-Chinese joint venture was no longer a Chinese import under any conventional definition. It was a North American product, eligible, under existing trade frameworks, for access to the North American market. The wall that American tariffs had built around Chinese automotive technology had just acquired a side door, and Canada had handed out the keys. At 9:14 in the morning, 2 days after Trump's press conference, Mark Carney walked to a podium in Ottawa and delivered a statement that lasted exactly 19 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He did not name Trump by name until the final 3 minutes. He began with Canada's EV sales figures. He cited the 74% growth. He cited the 21,000 vehicles sold in March. He noted that while the American EV market was contracting under policy uncertainty, Canada's was expanding at a rate that was, in his word, structural, not a spike, not a trend, a permanent shift in consumer behavior driven by government policy, infrastructure investment, and competitive pricing. Then he turned to the supply chain. He explained, with the quiet precision of someone who has spent his career reading the anatomy of financial systems, exactly how the North American automotive supply chain works, how a single component crosses the border multiple times, how the 25% tariff was not a tax on Canadian imports. It was a compounding penalty applied to a system that the United States had built to be borderless, and was now trying to enforce borders upon. He said every dollar of tariff applied to a Canadian automotive component does not come from Canada. It comes from the American consumer who pays more for their vehicle. It comes from the American supplier whose costs increase. It comes from the American worker whose company cannot compete because their inputs have become artificially expensive. He paused for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "The president has described this as protecting American jobs. The arithmetic describes it differently." The room was very quiet. He continued. Ontario, he announced, was accelerating its gigafactory program. 3 new battery production facilities would break ground within the year, positioned adjacent to hydroelectric infrastructure, funded through a combination of provincial incentive and international private investment. Canada was not simply trying to sell more electric vehicles. Canada was building the complete electric vehicle value chain: mineral extraction, refining, battery production, vehicle assembly, energy management software, and battery recycling, entirely within its borders. And then he said the sentence that was already being circulated in Brussels, Tokyo, and Seoul before the press conference had ended. The United States is changing, and Canada must adapt. He did not say it as a threat. He said it the way a physician delivers a diagnosis, with calm, with precision, with the particular authority of someone who has already done the analysis and knows that the numbers support only one conclusion. Within 24 hours of Carney's statement, Ursula von der Leyen called Ottawa. The call was not announced in advance. It was not reported in real time. It became public only when the European Commission's press office issued a brief readout 2 hours after the call ended. The readout used language that, in the measured vocabulary of European diplomacy, represented something close to a declaration. It called Canada a strategic partner of the first order in the transition to clean industrial production. It referenced the SAFE initiative, the European Defence and Industrial Programme valued at €800 billion, and noted that Canada's participation in associated frameworks was actively under discussion. It noted that European businesses were assessing opportunities in Canadian critical mineral processing and battery manufacturing. Translated from diplomatic language into plain English, it said this: Europe is moving its supply chain investment to Canada. This was not an idle threat. The European Union had committed hundreds of billions of euros to building an industrial base that did not depend on geopolitical volatility. Canadian lithium, nickel, and cobalt, processed on Canadian soil, powered by Canadian hydroelectric capacity, represented exactly the kind of stable, Western-aligned supply that European manufacturers needed to reduce their dependency on China, without replacing it with dependency on an unpredictable United States. Canada was not just gaining a trade partner. Canada was gaining the structural anchor of a new economic bloc. Three former American trade representatives identified what was happening before most of Washington had finished reading the morning briefings. One called it the most elegant supply chain realignment since the Marshall Plan. Another described it as the moment the United States discovered that threatening your neighbors creates their alliances. The third said simply, Canada is becoming the bridge, and we built them the bridge by making our side of the river too expensive to cross. General Motors cut its Canadian investment projections. Stellantis revised its North American EV roadmap, withdrawing from several planned Ontario-based programs. Smaller automotive suppliers, the companies that live in the gaps between the major manufacturers, supplying the components that move across borders dozens of times, began filing for restructuring protection. Their cost models had been built for a borderless supply chain. In a world of 25% compounding tariffs, those models no longer worked. The senior leadership of the American automotive industry, men and women who had spent decades building the integrated North American manufacturing system, began doing something they had not done in the previous 18 months of trade escalation. They called their lobbyists, their senators, their representatives. And the message they delivered was not the one the administration expected. They did not ask for more protection. They asked for the tariffs to stop. Because what they could see, reading their own supply chain data, was a scenario more frightening than anything a press conference could produce. If the policy continued, if the uncertainty deepened, if Canada continued to build its independent EV ecosystem with European capital and Chinese battery technology, the center of North American automotive production would not remain in Michigan. It would move to Ontario. Not because Ontario was more efficient, not because Canadian workers were better, but because Ontario would be on the correct side of the tariff wall. Because Ontario would have access to European markets, to Asian supply chains, to critical minerals processed under stable policy, without the uncertainty that was now baked into every American manufacturing investment decision. Detroit was not losing a competitor. Detroit was watching the center of gravity move. There is a concept in financial systems called reflexivity. It describes the phenomenon where a process, once set in motion, generates the conditions for its own acceleration. The more it moves in a direction, the stronger the forces pushing it further in that direction become. What the Trump tariffs had done to the Canadian EV strategy was reflexive. Every tariff increase made Canadian manufacturing relatively more attractive. Every uncertainty about American policy made Canadian policy stability more valuable. Every dollar redirected from American automotive investment to Canadian gigafactories made Ontario's supply chain deeper, more capable, and more competitive. The wall being built to pressure Canada was simultaneously being used as the foundation on which Canada's industrial independence was constructed. By the time the administration had completed its second round of tariff escalation, major battery manufacturers from South Korea and Japan were conducting formal assessments of Canadian production facilities. Their analysts were not asking whether Canada was a viable alternative to the United States. They were asking how quickly they could move. EV sales in Canada had already risen 74% in a single year. The rebate program was driving adoption that was building consumer demand, that was justifying the infrastructure investment that was attracting international capital, that was generating the jobs that were reducing Canada's economic dependency on the American market. The policy designed to weaken Canada was accelerating Canada's economic independence, and in Washington, in certain quiet offices, people who understood supply chains and trade mathematics were beginning to recognize that the window for reversing this process was not unlimited. Every month that passed, every contract signed, every factory that broke ground, every gigawatt of battery capacity that came online in Ontario, each one made the integrated North American system that the United States had built slightly less necessary to Canada's industrial future. The leverage was not infinite, it was draining. At approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, on the day that the European Commission readout was published, a reporter asked Mark Carney a direct question. Prime Minister, does Canada intend to permanently reduce its economic dependency on the United States? Carney looked at the reporter for 3 seconds. Not the aggressive 3 seconds of someone about to deliver an attack, the calm 3 seconds of someone deciding exactly how much of the truth to offer. Then he said, Canada intends to build the strongest, most diversified, most technologically advanced industrial economy it is capable of building. We have the minerals, we have the energy, we have the partnerships, we have the policy, and we have something that perhaps right now we did not previously have. He paused. The motivation. The room understood what he meant. Every tariff had been a gift. Every threat had been an accelerant. Every insult to Canadian industry had converted another Canadian business, another Canadian politician, another Canadian community into a constituency for economic independence. Washington had spent months trying to break Canada's will to resist. Instead, it had manufactured Canada's will to build. By the end of 2026, the arithmetic of the EV war had become visible to anyone willing to read the numbers. American car prices had risen, not by $1,000, not by $2,000. Industry analyses showed increases of $3,000 to more than $10,000 per vehicle, depending on the model, every cent of it paid by American consumers who had been told the tariffs would protect them. American automotive sales projections showed a potential drop of 1.5 to 2 million vehicles per year if the tariff structure remained in place. Not because Americans didn't want cars, because the cars had become, for millions of families, too expensive to buy. Ontario was breaking ground on gigafactories. European capital was flowing north. Asian manufacturers were running cost-benefit analyses on corridor routing. Canada's EV market share had doubled in a single year and was continuing to grow. And the American automotive industry, the $1.2 trillion industry, the 10.1 million job industry, the industry that the tariffs were designed to protect, was filing restructuring documents, cutting investment, and sending lobbyists to Congress with a message that had become impossible to ignore. We built the most integrated manufacturing system in human history, and we are dismantling it with our own hands. Donald Trump came back from Beijing and called Canadian automakers thieves. He threatened to make the Canadian automotive industry disappear. He did not understand what he was threatening. He was not threatening a foreign competitor's market share. He was threatening a system that American companies built, that American workers depend on, that American consumers rely on every time they buy a car. Mark Carney did not respond with threats. He responded with a folder on his desk that he had been preparing for exactly this moment, with a pivot to electric vehicles that turned every tariff into a recruitment advertisement for Canadian industry, with a call to Brussels and Seoul and Tokyo that said, quietly and without drama, Canada is open for business, stable policy, clean energy, strategic minerals, long-term commitment. He opened a door that was not supposed to exist, and capital walked through it. Every tariff Trump added made the corridor more attractive. Every threatening press conference made Canadian policy stability more valuable. Every month of uncertainty in the American market made Ontario's industrial ecosystem more competitive. Trump tried to pressure Canada into submission. He gave Canada the motivation to build a future that does not require American permission. He tried to protect American industry with walls. He gave the world a reason to build the road around them. And somewhere in Ottawa, a former central banker who once redesigned the global financial system after the worst crisis in a generation is looking at EV sales figures that rose 74% in a year, at gigafactories breaking ground beside Canadian rivers, at European leaders who have stopped treating Canada as an American satellite and started treating it as a peer. He is not celebrating. He is doing what economists do when the data confirms the analysis. He is reading the next number.